he basically decided that things were getting nowhere, that the methods being used were frankly ridiculous, given that the guerrillas were within the villages and within the population, and so he basically started shooting people. Hello, welcome to 10 Walks that Explain the Netherlands. I'm Nicholas Walton, and this is the fourth of the walks that I'm using to explain the Netherlands. It's actually the third video that I'm making of these 4 walks. This one is on the beautiful island of Texel, which is one of the Wadden Islands. It's the largest one. It's just off the coast of North Holland. They sit on top of the Netherlands above the North Sea as it goes towards Germany. And they're a lovely place full of woods and small villages and farmland, and then stunning beaches with, if you can see behind me, all of these sand dunes which go back for a kilometre or so inland. Lots of seabirds. You can see the seagulls taking off behind me. There's fishermen off the coast. There's holiday makers cycling around and eating pancakes, and it's a lovely place to be. Now, in the last one of these videos, we spoke about the way the empire started with spices and glory and money coming out of everywhere, and then by the end of it was a very changed place. And of course, it ended with the occupation both of mainland Netherlands and the Dutch East Indies themselves by the Japanese. So everyone knew that no matter how much the Dutch were willing it, things would end at the end of the war. There was a Dutch phrase, and it was repeated often during the war, and it basically suggested that losing the Indies brings disaster. The idea was that without the Indies, the Netherlands was just this little country in northwestern Europe, and a grey, humbled country in a grey and pretty desperate continent as well, with an economy that's wrecked. If nothing else, the Dutch East Indies used to bring a great deal of prestige to this small place, as well as oil revenues and so on. Just before the war, they contributed about 15% of the Dutch GDP. So not nothing, not a great deal. But anyway, as I said, towards the end of the war, it became obvious that holding on to it wasn't going to be as easy as they had imagined. Back to Indonesia, or the battle for Indonesian independence, led by Sukarno, who had grown in influence and been able to organise himself under the Japanese occupation. And of course the Dutch, many people were mobilised, many men were told to join the army straight away after being freed from the occupation of the Germans, and shipped off to the Dutch East Indies. And it was one of those post-colonial independence wars that was confused, inglorious at times, quite grubby, and certainly in certain areas was actually quite ghastly. There was a chap called Raymond Westerling, who I think he was half Greek, half Dutch, and he was born in Constantinople, which is why he was called the Turk. And he operated in Sulawesi, and he became infamous because when I say operating, he basically decided that things were getting nowhere, that the methods being used were frankly ridiculous, given that the guerrillas were within the villages and within the population, and so he basically started shooting people. Summary executions of anyone he suspected. Hundreds, he admitted to hundreds himself, but his unit in Sulawesi was responsible for thousands of deaths, and others copied them. And they weren't the only ones. The Westerling method was an extreme end of what happened, but you know, all of these young men a long way from home, desperate, trying to work out what they were doing, and the local population, they were caught between two groups that were at worst murderous. Many people suffered, and this was after the suffering of the Japanese occupation years. And by the end of the 40s, it was over. There was nothing that the Dutch, this small, bedraggled post-occupation country in northwestern Europe, could do about it, and Indonesia became independent. What was interesting was just how long it took many Dutch people to come to terms with what had happened, because of course they'd just undergone the Nazi occupation. There were some who fought against the Nazis. There was the Holocaust went on with certain bit of administrative help from the Dutch government and the authorities. And there were those that outright collaborated. Some joined the Waffen-SS, fought in German colours, especially on the Eastern Front. And then they were caught up in this, but you know, the occupation ended, and they had this tendency to think of themselves as, well, we're free from the Germans, we must have been the good guys. And then what happened over in the Dutch East Indies was they were caught up in yet another absolutely disgusting, brutal military action. And, you know, the Sukarno's lot committed a lot of atrocities. The Dutch committed atrocities, such as Raymond Westerling. It took the Dutch a long time to be able to come to terms with this. There were testimonies made, there were investigations, but a lot of the time they were suppressed. And the Dutch turned their back on it. There was even an interview with Raymond Westerling, who ended his life. I mean, he wanted to be an opera singer. At one point, I think he worked in a second-hand bookshop, and he ended up being a swimming lifeguard over in the eastern Netherlands, if I'm correct. Someone interviewed him, but it was never broadcast. But then in the 60s and 70s, it actually started to become better known. And in the Netherlands today, there's certainly a bit more of a movement trying to understand what happened in that war of independence, but also what happened at other points in the big colonial story. What happened, you know, under the buccaneering VOC and those who forged that empire and brought glories and prestige and enormous wealth to the Netherlands in the first place. So that is starting to change. I'm speaking to a few people who are especially involved in that. But as ever with empire, it's not a straightforward story. History is too difficult for that, so are human lives. But I think that there's a growing recognition that a lot of what happened under that glorious Dutch Empire, when they turned out towards that sea over there, was quite unpleasant.